Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this year's IDM Rollout webinar. My name is Luis Garza. I'm an engineer here at the Office of the City Engineer for the City of Houston, Houston Public Works. Thank you for joining us. We have a great program for you today. In recent years, collaboration between departments, service lines, engineers, and contractors have become the norm for Houston Public Works. The result of that collaboration can be seen in the department standards. I think this will be apparent in today's presentation. For today's presentation, I would like to set some ground rules. We will be taking questions via chat. Please place your questions in the chat box as the presentation is going. We have several presentations today. We will be allowing time for questions at the end of each presentation. We have a team here that will pull out the most applicable questions, and we will try to address those. Any questions we do not get to, we will try to address via website or email. If you're not familiar with the team's live event environment, this slide provides a quick guide. Select the Q&A icon on the right side of your screen and select the Ask a Question box near the bottom of the screen to ask your question. Under the Featured tab, you'll find all attendee questions. Under the My Questions tab, you'll find only questions you've submitted. When you type your questions, please note the IDM chapter and topic to give your question context. Before we present an overview of the updates during the 2020-2021 review cycle, here's a quick overview of the department's standards and specifications group. Our group oversees the city's infrastructure design manual, construction specifications, and standard drawings. Those are the documents that give direction on how to design and construct most everything built by and for the department. These documents communicate not only what the city wants from the project, but also to capture lessons learned. Throughout the organization, we are excellent at solving problems specific to a job or a project. One thing Houston Public Works is trying to improve is capturing those experiences so another PM or engineer does not have to repeat them. That is really the task of this group. We help capture lessons learned and provide technical support in developing these documents. We are a small group who is working to find the resources to grow so we can provide this much needed support throughout the department. For those of you who may not know, the Office of the City Engineer is tasked with making sure the city ordinances, design manual, and standards are carried out in the city's right-of-way. We see several hundred sets of plans a week for review. We are in a good position to see what is being done by development and by Houston Public Works' various service lines. We're also keepers of the IDM, standard drawings, and construction specifications. Seeing so many plans puts us in a good position to keep engineering and construction standards not only up to date, but to ensure the standards are being used correctly. Here's today's agenda. It seems daunting, but most presentations are fairly short. This is because we will be touching on the major changes to the IDM and its associated documents. This agenda is provided in the webinar announcement if you would like to keep track of the presentations as we move along. We will do our best to follow the schedule so attendees can count on when a subject matter will be presented. Okay, let's jump in. We'll start with a quick overview of the review cycle process. I would like to point out that an executive summary was released with this year's IDM. It includes a summary of the changes as well as implementation of the changes. This can be found at the front of the IDM. Per current policy, each chapter in the IDM will be reviewed at least once in 5 years. The city has a review schedule that is posted on the website. The associated standard drawings and construction specifications are to be reviewed in conjunction with each chapter review. This year was a Houston Water-focused review year. It included chapters 7, 8, 14, and 11. I'd like to also point out that if a significant issue is identified in any of the documents, it does not need to wait years to be corrected. Changes can be made outside of the review cycle for any given chapter. However, care is needed to make sure all stakeholders are informed and any issues have been properly vetted. A good example of this would be this year's changes to Chapter 17. Also, changes prior to July 1st can be made with the use of a supplement. Supplements, once properly vetted, must be signed by the city engineer and the director. The city has issued several this past year. Once a supplement is signed and put into effect, the standards group works to implement the standards, these updates, and notify the community effectively. Establishing the website, the distribution list, this webinar are all part of setting up effective communication to alert everyone of the changes in the city standards. The chapters listed here were modified off review cycle. The reasons for this will be discussed during each presentation section, as will be discussed later in the presentation. Chapter 9 updates were to incorporate the existing Chapter 9 IDM supplements. This slide helps depict the timeline that was followed for the review process. This is the same process we followed last year and how we'll continue operating moving forward. The cycle follows the city's fiscal year. In July, the city sends an e-blast out and posts on the website with an open comment period. This runs up until November. In August. This runs up until November. We spend a lot of time compiling these comments and organizing internal meetings to address these comments. A proposed city draft is created. Then we go into our external review of the draft to gather input from other organizations. This is to vet and coordinate all proposed changes before they are implemented. This year's implementation is a little bit different than the previous year's implementation. The city has typically made new requirements effective on July 1st, 2021. This year's updates were so extensive, and therefore the Houston Public Works Director and City Engineer saw it fit to allow a 90-day design grace period for implementation of the City of Houston's 2021 edition of the IDM. Therefore, for Houston Public Works capital improvement projects managed by Capital Projects Service Line Phase 2, final designs that have not been submitted for required review prior to October 1st must comply with all standards in the 2021 IDM. For projects in the public or private sector, plans submitted for initial review after October 1st, 2021 must comply with all standards in the 2021 IDM. The city must receive substantially complete plans before October 1st, 2021 to be grandfathered under the 2020 standards. Please note this exception. Chapter 9 IDM supplements were effective upon signature. There is no design grace period for Chapter 9 of the IDM. Therefore, Chapter 9 updates were effective April 1st, 2021. For additional background, refer to the 2021 IDM announcement and IDM executive summary. The IDM summary is provided at the beginning of the IDM document and gives implementation information for standard specifications and standard details. Above are a list of some of the members of the internal committee this year. We asked 2 representatives from each service line to participate. These representatives are asked to keep their service line updated as we go through the process. Once the city has developed the draft documents, all of the proposed changes, we work with the external partners shown here to gather additional input and make sure it is in sync with other agencies. Before we move on, let's talk about the website briefly. All the items discussed today can be found on the city's Design and Construction Standards website. An easy way to find the website is by Googling City of Houston Design and Construction Standards. This is what it looks like. With everything we do, we want to make sure that we are as transparent as possible. You will find red lines for all the changes online. We also introduced a revision bar to our document to better help identify these areas, which leads us to another presenter and engineer from the Standards and Specs group, Ross Ozuna. I guess also here is the preface. It's a new addition to the IDM. This document details the proposed and scope of the IDM and provides a description of the standards 5-year review cycle. It provides the city ordinance that gives the director and office of the city engineer the authority over these requirements. We wanted to shine a spotlight on this document as it summarizes the intent of the IDM requirements. It is located after the executive summary in the IDM. From here, I'll give the mic over to Ross Ozuna. Ross, please unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you, Luis. Sorry, guys, let me start that over. My name is Ross Ozuna, and I'll be going over the general changes that have been made during the 2020-2021 review cycle. As mentioned previously, the City of Houston will review certain IDM chapters every year and makes the revisions as necessary. Sometimes IDM chapters or specifications may require a change that is not part of the current review cycle. Those documents can still be revised by implementing a supplement in what we call an off-cycle review. The supplement will modify an existing document by removing or adding additional information to that document. Throughout the year, the supplement is used in conjunction with the original document it is modifying. If a supplement is active when a new review cycle is about to be released, the supplement will be incorporated into the final documents of that review cycle. Stormwater supplements, which were listed on the website this year and last year, were incorporated into the final IDM for this review cycle. The supplements that were incorporated were for IDM Chapters 9. There were no specification supplements during the 2020-2021 review period. Again, the changes implemented by these supplements are now included in the 2021 release of the IDMs. The review cycle has also incorporated change bars on our final documents. The change bars are located on the left side of the page and indicate that something has changed on the line of that page. For more detail on the exact changes that take place, please refer to the red lines that are available online. And again, the red lines are located at the Standards Review Committee tab on the Design and Construction Standards webpage. Keep in mind that the red lines were not provided for things that would be considered minor. Minor changes are those that do not affect how the specification is understood or does not affect the design criteria. For example, some specifications were revised that were not part of this review cycle due to an ASTM standard being mentioned in the text of the section, but it was not listed in the reference article. So therefore, we added it to the references. This would be considered one of the minor changes. We will still show change bars for the minor changes to signal to the reader that a change was made. During the last couple of review cycles, the Standards Review Committee decided to change how the chapters were arranged. That same change was made this year with the chapters that were part of this review cycle. You will notice that chapters 7, 8, and 11 are now organized into sections in order to help the reader navigate throughout the chapters and find exactly what they are looking for. We have also added a table of contents in the beginning of these chapters. The text in the table of contents has also been linked. So selecting that text will take you directly to the paragraph, figure, or table that you selected in the table of contents. Another thing that we continued adding during this review cycle were placeholders within the chapter. We realized that while navigating through a chapter, you may have to flip a few pages before or after to see what paragraph you are in. We added paragraph references near the top left corner of the page to help you navigate throughout the chapters. Please keep in mind that these changes discussed, such as the table of contents and section placeholders, these were only made to chapters 7, 8, and 11 because those were part of the original review cycle. The same changes were not made to other chapters such as 3 and 17 because making these changes would require a more in-depth review of those chapters, which was not possible during this time. I believe Luis spoke briefly about this. A new addition to the IDM is the IDM preface. This document details the purpose and scope of the IDM. It provides a description of the standard's 5-year review cycle. It provides the city ordinance that gives the director and office of the city engineer the authority over these requirements. We wanted to shine a spotlight on this document as it summarizes the intent of the IDM requirements. It is located after the executive summary in the IDM. So if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the chat. Thank you.
Hi, we have a question here. Are all of today's presenters from the same service line?
I think I'll take this one, Ross.
Sure.
So the presenters in today's presentation, they are from different service lines throughout Houston Public Works, but they all work for the Department of Houston Public Works.
Great, thank you. And a second question here. When will the other chapters get table of contents and chapter placeholders?
Thanks, Katie. So as Luis showed on one of the introduction slides, every year is a set list of chapters that have been decided within the policy to be reviewed during that year. So when that year comes around and it's those chapters dedicated review year, that's when the in-depth review for those chapters will take place. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Well, we don't have any more questions in the chat. So up next, we have Luis Garza presenting on chapters 3 and chapter 6.
Thank you for the introduction, Katie. Both Chapter 3 and Chapter 6 were not officially part of this review cycle. They've been updated based on changes made to Chapter 7, waterline design requirements, and Chapter 11, geotechnical and environmental requirements. First, I'll present the change made. The changes made are regarding new electronic submission requirements for drawings submitted to Houston Public Works. That is followed by new borehole drawing requirements. This portion of the presentation will conclude with changes made to Chapter 6 on levels of SUE. OCE has been receiving electronic drawings submitted through the Project Docs system, which is a great improvement in processing. Engineers within the city receive and review those drawings, have encountered a common issue with the drawings submitted. The PDF files contained hundreds of comments automatically generated, usually by the AutoCAD program. The additional data within the PDF takes up a lot of computer memory and makes viewing and working with the document difficult. Therefore, a requirement that PDF drawings are to be a minimum resolution of 400 dpi, devoid of the auto-generated AutoCAD comments, and all annotations and form fields are to be flattened. A new section has been added to Chapter 11, which describes engineer of records efforts. In this section, a new drawing requirement is established for boreholes. Borehole information is to be included in drawings for projects that contain tunnel shafts greater than 30 feet, and the project also uses the standard specification 2400 tunnel shafts. This requirement was added because it was identified that contractors may not have ready access to boring reports in the field, but they will usually have a plan set easily available. Chapter 3 gives guidance on the drawing requirements. The drawings must contain a borehole layout and a borehole log information. Layout is to include borehole number, station offset, northing, easting from the project's design baseline, borehole number or identifier, topo and survey benchmark, and design baseline. Borehole log drawings are to provide the borehole log places in ascending, Borehole log drawings are to provide the borehole logs placed in ascending stationing with 6 bore logs per sheet. The following example can be found in Chapter 3. Here's an example of a borehole layout sheet. Here's an example of the borehole log sheet. In Chapter 7, Appendix A, the IDM gives guidance on subsurface utility engineering. otherwise known as SUE. It was decided to define SUE in Chapter 6 and provide the levels of SUE so the city can give better guidance on which levels are to be performed on projects. On the right, you will see an excerpt from Chapter 6 on defining the levels of SUE. We have also added a reference to ASCE 38-02 to provide additional background. That concludes this part of the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat at this time.
Sorry, Luis, I was muted again there. We have one question that came in. So here we go. Can we request changes at any time or at a specific time duration?
I think that might be a question for the last part of the presentation, if I understand this correctly. Changes to our standard specifications, details, and IDM, you can send a request in at any time. Although if the question is not in the agenda for that review cycle, that question might be held for a future modification. As stated in the previous presentation, if there's something that's identified in one of those standard documents that is a major issue, we will see that, identify that, and reach out across the city to make sure that that is updated outside of the review cycle, so that that major issue is addressed.
Okay, great. One more question. Could you please repeat what qualifies to be grandfathered from this year's IDM updates?
Yes, so for this year's IDM updates, the item that was discussed in that part of the presentation had to do with public-private projects. Those public-private projects, they must be submitted, their plans must be substantially completed and submitted prior to October 1st for them to be grandfathered to the 2020 standards.
All right, another question came in here. It makes a lot of ease and user-friendly as well to combine borehole layouts and detail sections. Has that been considered?
What I'll say is that during this review cycle, our review committee discussed many different options that could be on many different options of how to incorporate the boreholes logs. And out of all of that discussion, this was what was agreed upon based on the coordination across departments. When it comes to this particular item, I think we have Mike Pizzeski here from his group in technical services has a big part to do with these requirements. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Would you repeat that?
Sure, and we have a clarification that came in on this. It makes a lot of ease and it's easier and more user-friendly to combine the borehole layouts and soil profiles. Has that been considered? And from what I remember, I was working on this firsthand. We wanted to keep that information separate to not imply we are creating and handing you a soil map. That is not the intent. It's used for analysis, so we wanted to keep those two items separate, if I remembered correctly. But Mike, go ahead.
Are we, if you are talking about the geotechnical report, those items are already we are having it in geotechnical reports. So
these are the plan requirements, Mike.
The plan requirements. I really don't have a preference on that. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
All
Yeah,
right.
Ross, I think that you kind of captured that. That was what was discussed in our meetings. And at the time, like you said, the review cycle decided to put this particular information at the moment, and we'll be considering that in the future. But this is a requirement that was settled upon across service lines.
Right. It looks like we got time maybe for another question. We got another one that came in. What does substantially complete mean?
So I think maybe both Katie and I can probably talk about this a little bit. For those public-private plans, I think we had a chapter, or maybe even Kathleen here on the line can talk a little bit about it. Previously, we had a supplement for Chapter 9, and there were some plans that were submitted to HPC that weren't complete or weren't even near being completed, and they had been submitted in an effort to try to be grandfathered in. And so substantially complete, in my perspective, is a plan that is complete and does not need changes to be made for its submittal. That those plans are ready to be submitted. Kathleen or Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
Right, yes. Oh, sorry, Kathleen.
Yeah, you're correct, Luis. Normally when we look at a plan, okay, if, for example, if they are submitted for the storm to review, where they don't even have a lot dimension or lot size or the proposed pipe dimension, diameter, the length, then that is considered as incomplete. So it all depending on what now. We do have a list when the Chapter 9 was going in on April the 1st. We do have a list to say, for example, you have to have WCR, you have to have size, you have to apply, you have to address. So it's a list of things that you'll see what type of project we are going to say is substantially complete.
All right.
Yeah. Did I confuse you more?
That was clear to me, Kathleen.
Okay, thank you.
I hope we cleared it up with the attendee.
Yeah. Ross, I think there's something also to be said on the question that was posed earlier about submittal before October 1st. CIP plan projects, those work a little differently. I would ask all the attendees to read the executive summary at the beginning of the IDM. It talks about, I guess, all of our standard documents and when they go into effect. For phase 2 designs, I think I went through and talked about it a little bit in this earlier. But those have to be submitted. They must comply with the new requirements if they haven't submitted their drawings per the first design submittal for phase 2. It's the best that I understand it. But I would refer everyone to those documents to get more clarification on all of the requirements on the deadlines.
All right, Luis, would you like to field one more question?
I think we might need to move forward, Ross.
Okay. Well, then we will, that concludes this part of the presentation. All unanswered questions we will address after the webinar. But we will be moving on now to Chapter 7. We will be, was I muted? I'm sorry. We will be moving on to Chapter 7, Water Line Design Requirements, which will be presented by Ms. Venus Price of Drinking Water Operations. Go ahead, Venus.
Well, I show that I'm sharing my screen, but I can't.
We see it.
See it. Oh, you see it? Okay.
Yes,
great.
ma'am.
All right. Hello, today I'll be briefing y'all on the changes to the water line design requirements in Chapter 7 of the IDM. This is the table of contents for Chapter 7. We'll be going through the changes largely in order of the chapter. This is a summary of the more significant changes in the chapter. If you go through the red lines, you may think the changes to the chapter are extensive, but in at least some cases, the red lines reflect rewording or relocations or just clarifications. The rest of the red lines are mostly trying to catch all instances of the elements summarized in the slide, which are, as I said, the significant changes that I want to talk with you about today. There are a number of changes that we don't have time to talk about today, but are just as important. And if you don't pay attention to them at the start of your project, it may cost your project time and money to have to go back to make the necessary changes. So my advice generally is to have your team just sit down and read the chapter from beginning to end and to highlight things that are not already ingrained in your brains, be it any new thing that has been tweaked here, or maybe something that has been a requirement for a long time, but somehow just didn't get a lot of notice. The first item is dead ends. I'd like to start off, excuse me, by explaining the situation that has caused us to move down this path, because I know some of y'all really like cul-de-sacs and scenic roads that don't connect to anything. But for us, the situation is that we are required by TCEQ to perform monthly flushing of dead ends. So that means that when, for whatever reason, someone designs and constructs a dead-end water line in our jurisdiction, the city is now obligated to provide manpower and the finished water to go and flush water through that dead end. That's water the city has paid for to treat, and is perfectly good water. And it goes down the drain on a monthly basis for as long as that dead end exists. So what we are asking is that you all help us be good stewards of city resources, and not only not design dead ends, but if your project takes you in close proximity to a legacy dead end that exists out there, that you consider the feasibility of including looping that dead end into your project, which will likely help you in the long run with better water quality, pressure, and redundancy for your clients. So that's why we don't want any more dead ends. And the changes to this area do include that you can either find another water line to connect to, or loop the water line. So if you go to that chapter, you can find some options, and they can help you on that end. Trace wire. This change is just because the right-of-way is getting increasingly clogged, and we, meaning the city, contractors, everybody, need to be able to tell where things are. So this requirement comes with a newly created specification, 16124, and associated details. Depth of cover. Okay, what we've been finding is that a little while after we install a water line through a roadway, somebody comes along and changes the grade of that roadway. And now we have a water line at a shallower depth than we had originally planned. As we were looking into this issue and noticing that we're seeing significant number of breaks even on relatively new lines, we turned to a research paper done a little while ago for the city that had advised us to increase depth of cover to 5 feet. So that's what you're seeing. And how we have done that is just by eliminating the break between 12-inch and 16-inch lines and setting all lines 16-inch smaller at 5 feet minimum. You'll notice that we are trying to be mindful of certain realities in the right-of-way and are keeping the minimum clearance at 3 feet. Appurtenances. We spend a lot of time talking about pipe, but really it comes down to all the connecting structures in between the segments of pipe. What this tweaking of the language is trying to do is bring in and highlight engineering judgment by removing the restriction, while establishing that these appurtenances are more than how we tend to just see them sometimes, which is on paper. I think it's frustrating for all of us to have a new project that didn't consider maybe something minor for the project that actually ends up being a major deal for the city as well as the neighborhood. So when residents are impacted because we have to shut down a new intersection or water line because of where a valve was placed, or that a fire hydrant was just run over, or maybe a vent pipe placement didn't consider how fast people typically take that turn, you know, people begin to notice. Sometimes it's definitely about function, but sometimes it's also just about aesthetics and paying attention to how that adjacent resident will have to deal with the location of that appurtenance. So this language is just about trying to reinforce the mindfulness of placement of appurtenances. Water meters. It's been standard practice to get a water meter report when doing a project, but we wanted to just spell it out, such that even when you're only doing short segments of water lines, it's important to get a water meter report and reconcile it with the topo survey and the as-builts and your walkthrough for the area so that your project doesn't end up inadvertently cutting off service to somebody, and that you're correctly showing all elements in your plans. The reason we want all meter sizes to be called out in the plans is related to our asset management needs. Typically, people use the vertical text on the border of the plan view to call out elements from the topo, so potentially that's where water meter sizes can go. Water meters and fire systems. This topic actually touches several different groups at the city, not just DWO. It of course touches CAS, which is Customer Account Services, who does the meters, also BCE, Building Code Enforcement, OCE, Office of City Engineer, and also RC, Regulatory Compliance. The part that I want to talk about a little bit is the portion at the bottom, which is what my group tends to get into, and that's the incorrect belief that if you conduct a fire flow test on a given day, that you and or your client should expect that pressure should be, the normal operating pressure for that region indefinitely, and that you can then go and design a fire system based on that pressure. That's not the case. Pressure fluctuates, and the city is obligated to provide 35 PSI during normal conditions and on our side of the meter. So please make a note of that. Construction phase. These two items, again, are standard practice by some, more seasoned consultants out there, but we wanted to capture it in the IDM. For EORs, everybody wants a smooth phase 3. And you want to have a construction cost estimate to be in line with the bids. So this is something that contractors know, which is that if you require a large water line to be shut down for your project, it's unlikely that that shutdown will be possible during high demand months. We just can't shut down the line. So that's during the summer. Just be mindful of that and consider that in your schedule and your estimating to factor that in. The other item is about considering how design phase needs to provide enough room for construction phase to allow for not only construction, but placement of materials and machinery so that, for example, legacy PCCP in the right-of-way is not potentially undermined by the addition of loading or vibration on the line from that project. Wet Connect or TS&V? We get this question a lot, so we just decided it would be a good idea to add this section in to explain when one type of connection may be a better choice in a given circumstance. So have a read and apply as appropriate. Interconnections. This section is about interconnections between the city and another utility. Basically, this requires contract with the city, approval from TCEQ, and your own facilities that will maintain your own desired pressures on to your own customers. The city provides 35 PSI on our side of the meter. As we know, crossing the meter and backflow device typically causes a few pound drop. So please be mindful of that when designing your system. Thrust blocks. We would like to move away from thrust blocks towards restraint joint systems. This is because increasingly the right-of-way, as we all know, is just filling up. And thrust blocks, when they are designed and constructed correctly, can really take up some valuable real estate. Adding to that, someone else comes along in that same right-of-way a little while later. They run into this quote-unquote obstruction that they can't figure out what it is. Because as we know, thrust blocks generally aren't put on the P&Ps, so they start chipping away at it, and the next thing you know, the city is trying to figure out why we have leaks on relatively new water lines. So restraint joint is preferred with all the appropriately calculated lengths shown in the plans. As-built. This is a new section that was added because, again, collectively, all of the people who work in the right-of-way, spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out what is in the ground. Not knowing what is in the ground, it complicates construction phase, certainly for all of us. And so what this section is doing is enforcing the importance of the as-bills. This section puts the EOR, who will have to perform the CAD modifications to the drawings that may be needed, as sort of monitors of the as-bills to make sure that they understand what the drawings are reflecting as being, modified by the contractor, and that so when they go to CAD the information, they're aware of what's going on, aware of the changes, don't have any questions. So this means, during site visits and meetings, when you're already discussing these modifications and as you're going through the RFI process, this would be a good idea to ensure, a good time to ensure that those modifications are correctly being kept up on those as-bills. Also, anything that is going to get left in the ground that was not on the original plans, like shoring, for example, needs to be put on there. Additionally, as the EOR accepts submittals for pipes, valves, etc., the specific information called out in this section will need to be put in the as-bills so that future generations, when they find a set of plans, they have a solid idea of what it looks like underground for that project, what kind of pipe it is, etc. Clearances. We created two tables because we wanted to just make it easy for everybody to figure out what clearance was required in what circumstance. So most of the clearances are standard, but some pipe material require a wider clearance, and that clearance is different if you're crossing above or below. Also, we brought in the special clearances that Stormwater was requesting from their chapter. If you look at the tables, which are split up by horizontal and vertical minimum clearances, you'll see they're mostly recognizable values, but for PCCP and bar wrap pipe, we want you to provide a little additional space. Also, please note the starting paragraph for this section does establish that these are minimum clearances, and we're looking to the EORs to consider their projects, the right-of-way, the existing conditions, the access, etc., and modify these clearances as appropriate. Minimum easement widths. If you're designing a water line 24-inch and above, have a look at this. This is in Appendix A of Chapter 7. I do see this portion of Chapter 7 moving over to Chapter 5, which is the easement chapter in the near future. But being this is new addition, I wanted to just bring your attention to it. That's it for the highlights. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
Hello, Venus. This is Luis. Chapter 7 is quite popular, as you could imagine, in our chat window. I have a few questions to ask. One question is regarding Table 7.2. Was the depth of cover report done by the University of Houston?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have other questions here.
Go ahead.
In looping the lines, what if the pipe sizes are not the same?
Well, the pipe sizes are often not the same. So in that case, there are formulas and judgment and modeling that can be applied. And if you have a question, come to us.
Okay, thank you. Another question we received is the dead end water line looping requirement, is it applicable to the ETJ projects?
I would say anywhere that you need the city engineer to sign off on your plans, it's applicable there.
Another question we received is, are the new dead end line rules also applicable to facilities that City of Houston does not maintain, i.e. Lines being maintained by utility districts?
I would again say if you need OCE to sign your plans, it applies.
Okay. We have a few more here. Let's see. Who decides what constitutes as a reasonable distance to an existing water line? How will the city determine when a developer is going to be required to build a water line through an existing development to eliminate an existing dead end?
That's a very good question, and we debated a little or a lot about that. Ultimately, we felt like it was folly to come up with a particular linear foot because every project is different. Some projects, it could be, a Herculean task to incorporate another dead end line that's only 100 feet away from your project. And some projects, it might be relatively easy to go much more than that. So again, the goal was to bring back in engineering judgment into this chapter and realize that we're all just trying to do the right thing. And if you guys have any questions, just let us know. But I would venture to say the appropriate time to be asking these questions is at the beginning of your project when you're trying to scope it and go through negotiations. So the thing to do would be to get your scope from the city, really look at that alignment, get the as-builts, everything that you do in advance, and try to look and see what your existing alignment is and what's around you. And if you want to, say, hey, there's an opportunity here that I can help my client as well as the city by eliminating one or two dead ends here, at the beginning of your project would be the time to figure that out and scope it out. Thanks.
Okay, Venus, another question we have is, how do I know if a water line on my project is to be looped?
Well, it can't be dead-ended. So either you're going to have to connect it to another water line, or you're going to have to loop it. That's pretty much your options. So if you have a nearby water line that you can connect it to, fantastic. I would say that's definitely our first choice. We don't want to be seeing loops just because it's convenient. If there's another water line that you can connect to, perhaps via a utility easement from cul-de-sac to cul-de-sac, again, something that needs to be considered at the beginning of your project, that would be the thing to do. If there's no other option, I don't really see how you can get away from looping.
Okay, we have another. Actually, we're pretty close to time here. I think we should probably move forward, Venus. The unanswered questions we'll share with you and try to get those answered at a different time.
Okay.
So that brings us to Chapter 8, Wastewater Collection System Design Requirements. This will be presented by Daniel Ofner from Wastewater Operations. And also on the line here is Kathleen Bullock from the Office of the City Engineer. Dan, go right ahead and feel free to present. And Dan, if you haven't unmuted yourself, please unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me, Louise?
Yes, sir.
Okay. My name is Dan Opner. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director over here at Collection System Maintenance. Great to be with you here today. Before I get into it, I just want to do a quick call out to my guys. I have around 150 or so highly trained professionals that are going out there every day, rain or shine, normal times, pandemic times, do an outstanding job. We respond to roughly 24,000 service requests annually, and we perform roughly 2,400 sewer repairs, emergency sewer repairs on our system annually as well. So with that, I'll get right into Chapter 8, IDM updates. So Chapter 8 is divided into two sections. First section's a quick overview, and then the second section is the bulk of the, and it's the design requirements. So the first change we made was we added a couple of references. The data digitization standards was added, as well as building code enforcement reference was added. We also made a small change to the uniform plumbing code. We added the words local amendments to that reference. An item had to do with definitions. There were just a few changes, to be honest. The first one was we updated the public sewer definition. The main item that was added had to do with providing 50-foot wide public access easements for sewers located outside the city right-of-ways. And then with that revision, we also then deleted the sewer line definition and rolled it into that and made it one definition, and then updated throughout the chapter to follow these definitions. The next item had to do with the service lead. We made some minor rewording changes. Building sewer was also some minor rewording. We also clarified that the building sewer is a private sewer, and so we wanted to make sure that was called out clearly. Community sewer was also, we had made some minor rewording changes. And the one definition that we did add was single family residence. This is referred to a few times in the chapter, and we just wanted to make sure it was clear what a single family residence was. We kind of made it easy on ourselves. We just, we used the same definition that's shown in the Code of Ordinance, Chapter 47, Article 3, Section 121. So some of the design requirements changes. One of the main ones had to do with floodplain elevations, delineating that in our plans. And previously it was always the 100-year flood elevation. And now in the Houston Code of Ordinance, they've also updated that to follow a 0.2% flood elevation, which roughly translates to the 500-year elevation mark. Another change we did was now we require record drawing numbers to be shown on our PNPs. This is really helpful going forward. Another design change we made had to do with updating standards for limiting connections to sewers that are located in backlot utility easements. This is always a bit of a maintenance nightmare when there's connections in the backlots, having to deal with customers. So the language we added had to do was service leads shall not be connected to the backlot easement unless both A, there is no front lot sewer to connect to, and B, the development consists of no more than one service unit. So that was the main language that was just added into that. Some other changes we made, this had to do with the next item 11, had to do with where we bolt down manhole covers and gasket them. where that's required. And that also follows what was previously discussed about the floodplain elevations. So we updated this standard to reflect that as well. We have a new cleanout sizing criteria. The cleanout diameter must be at least equal to the diameter of the pipe to which it's attached. So for most cases, this doesn't really change too much. The cleanout diameters can almost always be 6-inch in diameter, but there are some exceptions. Next change we made was a new manhole location criteria. This is also reflected in some of the other chapters, but we wanted to keep manholes out of driveways and out of tire paths along roadways as much as possible. And then the next change we made was for commercial service leads. Previously, so the minimum size for a commercial service lead is now 8 inches in diameter. And because of this, you're now required to tie directly to manholes since it's 8-inch. Previously, this Previously, this was only applicable in the central business district, but we basically spread it throughout the city. And that takes us through all the changes. Wasn't nearly as many as drinking water operations, but at this point, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat. Thanks. Did I put everyone to sleep? Is everyone still there?
We're still here.
Yes, Dan. There are no questions so far over the content you shared. So we can wait maybe a couple more minutes. Let's see. All right, we got some coming in.
I must have done a great job.
First question here. Can we place a private manhole inside the property on the driveway?
A private manhole. So this relates to public manholes. So that I may need to check on with Kathy Lee and get back on that one.
All right.
Yes, you can place a private in the private property, but not in the public, inside the public right away.
Right, along the driveway apron or
Yeah, not in the apron, but inside the private property, and that would be marked as a private manhole.
Thanks, Kathy.
Dan, we got I think another question about wastewater here. Will covers in floodplains be completely solid?
Yeah, that is definitely a requirement. Where we don't allow open pick holes in the lids, and they need to be sealed and bolted down and system vented.
Okay. We got some more.
Really, there weren't too many changes in this chapter, so I'm not surprised there weren't too many questions.
Got it. I think one here. Are we to use UFC federal codes as references or just ICC?
That I'm not sure. Are we talking about the record drawing plan shown on the PMPs? Is that what we're talking about?
We can wait to see if he clarifies. That was all is provided there. I think we got another question following up on the private manhole one. What if the private manhole is making a connection to a public manhole? Can we still propose that on a driveway?
So I mean, we do not want to see manholes in driveways, but of course there's always exceptions, and there'll be some cases where it'll be necessary, but for the most part, this is what we're trying to avoid. So this is the guidance that we're providing. Variances are always possible if a case can be made to support it.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I think we should probably move on here. Getting close to the next presentation time. Sure, I have my screen shared. So with chapter 8 wrapping up, we will move into chapter 14, facility design requirements. That will be presented by Luis Garza, part of the Standards and Specs group, and Sandeep Agarwal, part of Drinking Water Operations and Facilities. Take it over, guys.
Thank you, Ross, for that introduction. As said, Chapter 14 contained Houston Public Works facility design requirements. It is comprised of these 3 references: the Groundwater Plant Design Guidelines, Engineering Design Guidelines Manual for Submersible Lift Stations, Design Guidelines Drawings for Submersible Lift Stations. A common question received by the Standards and Specs group is where these documents can be found. They are found on the Houston Permitting Center's website on the same web page as the IDM. To provide quick access, web links directly to the documents have been added in the footer of this page in the IDM. Of the 3 documents referenced, Houston Public Works' Wastewater Facilities Group identified that their documents were to undergo extensive updates. Those updates were would not fit within the time frame allowed by the review cycle. Therefore, those updates will be a part of future updates. They're not included in the 2021 edition of the IDM. That leaves us to discuss the updates to groundwater plant design guidelines. The groundwater plant design guideline document was updated to match the IDM formatting, including article numbering, section bookmark numbering, and table of contents. Also, a reference was added to refer to Chapter 13 GIS Data Digitization Standards. This is to lay a groundwork for future additions to Chapter 13 regarding groundwater plant GIS requirements. The Review Cycle Committee received few comments on the groundwater plant design guidelines. Of those proposed changes, the Review Cycle Committee approved 1 proposed change to these guidelines. The accepted change requires booster pump sizing, header yard piping, and valves to follow the Hydraulic Institute standards. See Article 3.02.b on pump sizing. This article is similar to the article provided in Section 4 on header and yard piping. As stated, the engineer is to provide calculations and recommendations in the preliminary engineering report. That concludes the summary of changes to Chapter 14 in the 2021 edition of the IDM. I'll open it up to questions. Here to represent Houston Public Works Drinking Water Operations Facilities Group is Managing Engineer Sandeep Agarwal. Ross, if you have any questions from the attendees, please ask away.
Thanks, Luis. It looks like we only have 1 question so far. Hold that up. There were comments submitted for the submersible lift station guidelines. Although the guidelines will have future updates, were those considered this review cycle?
I'm sorry, Ross, can you repeat the question?
Sure. There were comments submitted for the submersible lift station guidelines. Although the guidelines will have future updates, were those considered this review cycle?
So yes, during the review cycle committee meetings, those comments were reviewed by the committee. The outcome of that review will be captured in the updates that are to come to those documents that Wastewater Facilities is working on. And if they were accepted at that time, they'll be added, and if they were not, they won't be included into those documents.
Okay. We only have one other question. It's kind of a design question, so we may not have the answer at our hand, but what is the minimum clearance between proposed 6-inch sanitary service leads and proposed water lines? Is it 6 inches still?
I believe that's in chapter 7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
that should
excuse
be,
me. So not part of this chapter section.
Yeah, that should be in chapter 7. Yeah, this is Sandeep Agarwal. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandeep. So anyone entering questions, we'll just be taking questions for chapter 14 at this time. If y'all have any, just enter them into the chat now.
Sandeep, it looks like we're waiting here. Do you have anything to, I guess, add or any thoughts on this process or anything you'd like to share with attendees?
I just want to tell attendees, that we didn't touch a lot of stuff in this chapter 14, but we are internally, groundwater, we are trying to standardize a lot of the equipment we're using at those facilities. I have 54 facilities, which a lot of them we inherited from the utility district. So it's very difficult to standardize, because we never got those standardized, when we got those. But internally, as we are moving forward with the CIP projects or improvements, we are trying to standardize a lot of that equipment. So it makes it easier on my operation and maintenance staff.
Great, thank you for that extra info.
Okay, Ross, it looks like we haven't received very many other questions. So I think we can go ahead and take our break a little early.
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, we can have the 10-minute break and resume the presentation at 1:20 with chapter 11, if that sounds good to everyone.
Sounds great, Ross. So we'll be back at 1:20.
All right, thank you.